Well, I want to thank everyone who showed up for this discussion on scaling DI&B with startups and with unicorns. My name is Jack, and I am the head of Midwest Partnerships for HubSpot for Startups. We have two rock stars on the stage with us today to discuss this topic. We have Shelisa Demuth, who is the executive director of Beta Minnesota. We also have Nadeau, who is a senior DI&B manager at HubSpot. And just a brief introduction to the sponsor of this event, HubSpot for Startups. We are a global program. And in the Midwest specifically, we have two missions. The first is to deliver the scalable tools that we provide to startups as early in their business as possible. But we also have a second mission, which is to build greater connectivity between startups and entrepreneurs in Middle America and the entrepreneurial ecosystem and community out there to support you. Because as folks know in this room better than I do, being an entrepreneur is a fundamentally lonely project. And when you're in the Middle America, it can become kind of difficult to lift your head up and realize the community that's out there to support you. So as you follow along with this discussion, as you have an opportunity to ask questions of our wonderful panelists, I hope you walk away with not just their wisdom, but also a greater understanding of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and community in Middle America. So without further ado, let's launch in. And I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves. And we'll start with our hostess, Shelisa, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, everyone. I'm Shelisa Demuth, the executive director here at Beta, which is the nonprofit organization that organizes Twin Cities Startup Week. We're so happy that you're all here with us this week and today. Prior to Beta, I was actually a HubSpot partner for a while with the PR firm that I founded. So I went from founder and community leader to nonprofit management, and it's been an adjustment, and it's been amazing. Beta has an incredible community here supporting founders like myself who are building their companies in Minnesota and really affecting the way that the tech community engages and interacts. So this conversation today is really interesting to me. Of course, I myself am a Black woman, originally from Minnesota. I grew up in a small town here. And so to be able to affect the change that we can from an organization that has the reputation that Beta does and has the community that Beta does, it was a really intriguing perspective, a really intriguing thing to consider last year when I was approached for the role. And so it's been an honor to grow and build with this community. Now we're focused on awareness of the resources that are available through Beta, the programs, of course, and then expanding that community to look more like our state.
Thanks so much. And Nick?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jack and Shelisa, for joining in this really awesome conversation. My name is Nick Nadeau. I work at HubSpot on their diversity, inclusion, and belonging team, which is really an honor. And I think part of the value of a conversation like today's is the ability to take what can really be abstract or otherwise fuzzy words and terms and really contextualize them and help us understand what diversity, inclusion, and belonging really looks and feels like on the ground when it's working well and also when it's not. I live in St. Louis Park, not far from here. Grew up in White Bear Lake and attended White Bear Lake Public Schools, which has consistently let us down in our sporting arena, but that is not relevant for today. And lastly, I would just add, everyone can play and should play a role in diversity inclusion work, and you don't have to be the world's most woke person. You don't actually even need passion, frankly. It just takes commitment. And as long as that commitment is authentic to you and who you are, in my opinion, that's what matters the most.
Thanks a lot for that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important in a space like this with a topic like this to level set. And so I'd love to start by just talking about how you use the words diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity. Those are words we're going to revisit a bunch in the coming 45 minutes or so. So Shelisa, we'll go back to you. Do you mind just defining how you use those words and maybe a little bit about why?
Yeah, of course. So internally at Beta, we've had a lot of conversations about this. And I think it's important to note that I'm definitely a part of a continuum from the founding of the organization back 9 years ago. I'm the 4th executive director of the organization, the 2nd female executive director, and the 1st person of color to lead the organization. And that's really notable. Diversity makes us consider, well, who's in the room, right? What does the room look like? And it's good that As a startup community here in Minnesota, we've definitely expanded that through different programs and resources. I see Mita's in the crowd today. They've certainly done a lot to support and uplift BIPOC entrepreneurs. But we see that definition expanding to what it really looks like in people who are doing the work. Do you want us to keep going on
Actually, I think that's a great
inclusion?
point. Let's go back and forth. So
Yeah.
diversity. Nick, go ahead.
I mean, couldn't have said it better. I think, just to add on what I find important to emphasize about diversity when our team teaches it at HubSpot and helps folks really understand what it means to them is that it can involve dimensions of difference. So race and gender are the most obvious ones, but also things like military status, faith background, our abilities and disabilities, are also our thought processes. All of those things combine to make us who we are. And when we say at HubSpot that we really like to think about diversity intersectionally, what we mean by that is just simply that none of us experiences any one of those dimensions of difference in a vacuum, right? We're constantly, we're humans. We're complex beings. And sometimes a negative or a positive experience I might have may in fact relate to many parts of myself, some of which I'm aware of and can articulate in the moment, some of which maybe not. And so individual diversity, I like to describe it that way. And when we talk about organizational diversity, which is what we're going to do today, I think it's about appreciating those differences and leaning into them to accomplish your mission.
And I think I'm going to take the next two terms together and we're going to stick with Nick for a second because HubSpot actually uses inclusion and belonging versus inclusion and equity, which is a bit of a difference. And there's no Oxford comma between the two terms. So can you just walk us through inclusion and also why belonging?
Well, as a former journalist, I have an opinion on Oxford commas, but we won't go there. And of course, I'd love your perspective as well on Oxford commas, but also on what inclusion and belonging mean for you in Beta. I think for us at HubSpot, we chose inclusion and belonging for a couple reasons. One is that diversity gets you in the door, right? It's that invitation to the dance. It's that ability to gather around your literal or proverbial conference table. What inclusion really is understanding how to have folks at the table seen, valued, and heard. And for that to happen, you might need to think through in advance different nuances to what inclusion could mean. Inclusion doesn't always just simply mean asking someone in the moment for their perspective. For example, it may mean giving additional time before or after that conversation for folks to think things through and weigh in. It also may mean not necessarily verbally noting, but mentally noting to yourself, okay, who are the voices in the room that I would like to elevate? Whose voices may or may not deserve to have a bit of unequal or disproportionate treatment because they might be the only one in the room, which is an experience a lot of folks of color have and folks of other marginalized backgrounds have. And lastly, belonging, I think, is often understood as really fuzzy. I don't know about you, Shelisa, but it's not necessarily this kumbaya, like we all have to get along and we're in a kind of a spiritual circle here, although that can happen. To me, belonging means that regardless of how I show up authentically as myself, that I have a place here. And that brings all of myself to work in the way that I choose and not in a way that is chosen for me.
Thanks so much for that. And Shelisa, I'll ask you just kind of to define those terms for you, understanding that you don't own HubSpot's lack of an Oxford comma there.
Here where we don't, but I think that we can agree. We can definitely agree. I really like what Nick mentioned about all of the parts of a person belonging in a place. We had a conversation just before coming on stage today about, which parts of us are considered professional and what that definition of professional is. And belonging has a lot to do with us considering the different parts that make us unique, the different parts that make us who we are, right? Our backgrounds and the way that helps us to relate to the world, and what that can really add to an organization when we take more into consideration than where we went to school and our different accomplishments. Though also important, that identity is really key. So I couldn't agree more on that aspect of belonging. And then inclusion, of course, is which voices are heard and who we elevate and who speaks up and what that means for who belongs.
Thanks so much for those definitions. I'd love to just kind of briefly also talk about equity. I mean, it's not part of the listed definitions for our conversation, but I think it's impossible not to touch on it. So I will keep with you, Shelisa, if you wouldn't mind talking to us about equity.
I can promise that this is something that will come up a lot this week and a lot in the next few months and the next few years. It's something that we've certainly been working to solve as leaders in the ecosystem, together with the community, and then also at Beta specifically. So equity is the most important part because, of course, while the other things are important to consider, it's important to consider who's in the room. Really, who wins and how do we win? Most importantly is the historical context. And so it can be scary to paint a picture, and there's a lot of history that can be debated. But when we can present as a community or as an organization, understanding the historical context and what that might mean for where we set the bar, that was another thing that we got to discuss prior to this conversation, is the bar isn't the same for everyone, and having those conversations and ensuring that the people that are represented in the room and the topics that we discuss really are inclusive of everyone's bar, and we're continuing to ask those questions about, what is the expectation for you, what is your lived experience, and then what does that mean for our organization in ensuring that equity is available and accessible to everyone, and that hasn't always been the case.
Nick, to you.
Yeah, I think there are different dimensions to think about when we think of equity. So starting at that kind of individual level, Shelisa just mentioned a lot of what equity comes down to is access, right? And so folks who historically have had less access or less equal access to resources, whether that's time, money, attention, et cetera, probably need different routes to gain access and maintain access to those resources over time. And so this is where the conversation around equal versus equitable comes into play. At the individual level, that is, that would mean that me, Nick, would not have any of my own dimensions of difference, whether acquired or inherent, affecting my ability to get access to opportunities. Being a Korean adoptee wouldn't matter, or an Asian American male. Being someone who grew up in a low middle income household in the outer suburbs wouldn't matter. Those disparities that would otherwise show up and do show up, especially here in Minnesota, they wouldn't be a factor. Unfortunately, they are a factor, and when we think about the organizational and then community levels of equity, that's thinking beyond just myself as a person and understanding, okay, historically, for example, redlining in the Twin Cities, probably this area is one of the most prominent places in the country when it comes to redlining and banks giving access to communities and denying access, especially to Black communities, for housing. That has an impact on more than just the 1950s or 60s. That has an impact on generational wealth, has an impact on our zip code, school districts, libraries, how good your fire department is. When we think about organizationally and at the community level, it's about more than just us. And I think that's where it gets tough, Shelisa, because sometimes, I don't know about you, but it can involve a lot of oppression Olympics, right? Folks competing for scarce resources or attention, and I think, I guess I'd love your opinion on that too, but the best way out of oppression Olympics to me is understanding how elevating one community doesn't have to come at my expense, right? We can all of us as boats can rise together, and that's something I think, especially in the VC and nonprofit space, is an argument that I think carries a lot of weight when I witness it happening. Based on my observations. I don't know if you have thoughts too. I'm taking over Jack's role here, but I'd love your take. I don't want to, dominate that kind of.
Sometimes my role is to get out of the way.
Yeah.
I think something you mentioned about accessibility, right?
Yeah.
So accessibility really being the key to a lot of these solutions that we're working so hard together to form. making the resources, making the equity, making the the education, making that accessible for people of all walks of life. However we are different, that is really that's the problem. Is that lack of accessibility. And so when we consider all boats rising together, I would agree there. That's where it comes back to standards and what is the bar, and then how do we make that a bit more equal for those who maybe haven't been as fortunate as the historic majority. Something we've also discussed is how interesting it is that Minnesota as a state is now a majority percentage people of the global majority here. So it's no longer a white majority in Minnesota, it's now a non-white majority in Minnesota as of 2019. And so considering what that means for our greater population, and a lot of folks trying to solve for that, but then also for entrepreneurship and funding and some of the issues that existed for a long time here in this state. It's been really interesting to collaborate with organizations like META to solve here locally.
Well, that brings us to the meat of our conversation, and I really appreciate the level setting, because it's mentioning that, especially about Minnesota specifically. If you're going to grow a startup in Minnesota, thinking about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity is now going to have to be part and parcel of how you grow that business. And it's not easy to grow a business, and growing it intentionally is even more difficult. And as we get into the meat of this topic, those of you who are kind of just joining us in person, definitely keep questions in the back of your mind. We will have Q&A. And if you're joining us virtually, feel free to just throw your question in the chat. Even if we get to it, you're going to be able to hear that question read at the end. So I'd love to move on to really applying the level setting that we just did. What should startups be thinking about from a DI&B perspective as they scale? What should they be keeping top of mind as they try and grow their business? And we'll start, Shelisa, with you.
That's such a great question. We think about what is oftentimes most scarce for startups, especially in the very beginning, the early stages, so getting off the ground. It's capacity, right? Where we put our focus, that's what's going to grow. A lot of times founders have limited resources, founding teams have limited resources, and it really is a balancing game of day to day and month to month to ensure you allocate your runway appropriately to make it to the success that every founder hopes for. So when we consider that and how we intentionally build a team, and we champion our values as we're building a team with a startup, it can be a lot to take on. I can certainly attest. One thing that's a common way to build a team for a startup founder, of course, you grab who's within reach. You grab who you know. You say, great, can you do this project for me? I have this budget. Let's use it, and let's use it to the best of our ability.
I got on a call with someone the other day, and I said, what's your role? He goes, well, I'm the husband of the founder, so I'm also the CTO. Said,
yeah, exactly. That's the truth. That's the truth. So in some ways, that's almost a scarcity mindset, where we have talented people around us. We use what we have. We're really nimble and scrappy, and we get things done, and we celebrate our wins, and we move past our losses really fast. And that is founder life for the first however long. After that, or even as that's happening, as we consider the type of organization, really the culture of the organizations that we want to build, a few things we have to consider. We have to consider our values. So regardless of what product or what service solution that we're bringing into the world with our company, what is the type of world that we want to live in? And then finding people who champion those values. So maybe your first two hires are people who look just like you. Know what your values are and the reason that you've aligned the culture and the company culture that you can build together with those people. And then consider what the world that you're, the customer that you're serving is really the other aspect to consider. So you consider your values, and then you consider who your target customer is. Make sure that those folks are represented. Make sure that really those perspectives are considered as you're building a solution. Because, of course, the last thing you want to have happen is you build the solution and you realize you didn't consider the end user. You didn't consider the person who's going to grow together with your company. So I think culture is really the biggest aspect and staying intentional as you make those early hires with people who align on your values.
I remember one of the very early, we're going to get to you, Nick, I promise. I'm not making up for the fact you stole the microphone earlier. I was in a sales gig earlier in my career, and I asked one of my mentors, I said, what values do you look for in customers? How do you know that there should be a conversation here? And the answer I got, smoking a cigar in Florida on a hotel balcony, was, Jack, I value anybody who wants to buy from me, hands down. And it's been a little bit different than that at HubSpot, but it is, I don't want to just vilify that answer. It is a balance. Like, you need to sell your product, but bearing in mind the culture and the values you want to bring to bear at every opportunity is important. All right, Nick, please, if you would.
No, first of all, I think, whether you're a startup, a scale-up, or a company that's been around for decades, in a different way, you're likely to experience around the same thing, which is that diversity inclusion is often thought of as a build-on or an add-on versus something that's actually woven in, right? And what Shelisa was speaking to is really important because it touches on having diversity inclusion run as a direct through line to your business and ultimately to your customer. That's something we teach a lot at HubSpot. It's certainly not something we get right. I don't think any company truly does 100% do that perfectly. But what I find most impactful is before you even think about having a chief diversity officer, before you think about bringing in a trainer or doing a workshop, all those things that are important. Before those things, however, it's really important to understand, purpose, values, and also how my business, how my place in the marketplace can be differentiated. And that, I think, is where diversity inclusion can truly unlock. I think much is made about the business case, which is what I'm talking about right now, for diversity inclusion. And all of that is true. You're going to be able to connect with customers that otherwise would be out of your reach. I think even more important, however, is that we're seeing nationally and globally diversity inclusion along with ESG and along with other elements of social impact or purpose. We're seeing this taking increasing prominence in how investors think and what value investors place in where they make their decisions. And I think BlackRock, right, and Larry Fink would be one example of a fairly large example, but it's not just Larry Fink.
The largest.
Yeah, that is where we are heading. And frankly, if you're not thinking about that stuff, you're going to increasingly be a dinosaur. And I think that's what we recognize at HubSpot and what we want our customers, who themselves are businesses, to recognize as well.
And Shelisa, you have I imagine a really great perspective on this because Beta accelerates small businesses, accelerates startups. Mm-hmm. And when we think about founders in a similar place to the businesses that are going through those accelerators, is there I don't want to say a trick, but an approach that even one of those businesses has taken that you found to be really impactful for how they grew?
It all comes back to intentionality. The most beautiful thing about watching accelerating businesses and watching founders take their concepts to companies that are helping hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people is the intentionality that goes behind every detail of a product. And that is why it's so important to consider who's around you, who's in the room as you're developing. And it's really important to consider the empathy that's required to bring something to market. If you are going to be intentional with the company that you're building, you have to be incredibly empathetic to the people that you're serving, whether it's something that seems wildly for-profit and that doesn't have any apparent social impact, or something that is very, very impact-driven. Regardless of what it is you're building, you have to be empathetic. And so specific companies, I could think of a lot of them. There's one in particular called Culture Booster. Culture Booster is a Beta alumni company. It's a survey and software. It's for data in measuring your efficacy as a company in employee retention and how you onboard and acquisition. And that founder, I've seen him do more in pulling in people who represent the employees that he's helping. And so his founding team looks a lot like who he serves, looks a lot like who benefits from the company that he's building, and as a result, the contracts that they're winning have been really exciting to celebrate with him on. As a Beta alumni founder and as a friend, just to see him be so intentional in the way that they're developing their product, the way that they're adapting and being empathetic to the people that they're serving, it's unmatched. It's the most exciting thing to watch grow. We're rooting for his success.
Thanks so much. I love giving specific shout-outs in these events. It's always just a blast. So I think one of the difficult things about this space, and Nick, you kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, is how do you metric success? You know, as you scale, you got to metric everything. You know, is it working? Is it not working? You know, as you've seen HubSpot approach this problem in different ways, how have they measured success? And have there been metrics that simply just haven't worked?
Yeah, you know, HubSpot being a publicly traded company as well as a company in the tech sector has a lot of benefits in that. Being in the tech industry, at least in the United States, it's actually quite normalized and expected to publish an annual diversity report, which includes metrics around representation, for example, and how diverse that representation is from a variety of lenses. But you know, I think that's becoming increasingly table stakes to see the diverse makeup or the lack thereof reflected in a company and organization's annual report. Where I think we're heading is measuring inclusion and belonging, which frankly is harder, and also really hasn't been tried very much up until this point in any sector, you know, private, government, or nonprofit. And at HubSpot, we do measure representation. So we have goals pegged to 2025 that break down by various dimensions of difference, including race, gender, and folks who come from a non-binary background, for example. I'll be the first to say that I think we have much more progress to make, much more specificity to get to in how we measure representation, but we're heading there. And I think the most valuable team or function you can have in an organization is their analytics team, whether that's people analytics or your customer analytics, because they are going to allow you, just as you would in determining your customer segment, pinpoint your employee segments where you're most behind and where disparities are most showing up. How do you measure, on the other hand, inclusion? It's tougher, but I think it comes down to behaviors. So there are behaviors that we can break down. These behaviors, for example, things like psychological safety, fostering trust, those foster inclusion. On the other hand, we can identify behaviors that foster exclusion. And HubSpot, we're getting there. We're having those conversations on how we best measure inclusion year over year, and belonging as well in terms of participating in ERG, Employee Resource Group events. That's one way we measure engagement, but there's certainly a lot more in our ENPS, our Employee Net Promoter Score results, and others that can help us pinpoint more quickly where we need the most attention.
Well, I can certainly relate to that as a HubSpot employee in terms of the ENPS score, the feedback on a quarterly basis about inclusion. All of those data points are being gathered, and now that we have that awesome example of the rocket ship NASA approach to DI&B, in an analytics team is not necessarily something you get as a startup right off the bat. Is there one or two metrics that you would look at? You've already mentioned people in the room. Are there one or two metrics you'd mention, Shelisa?
This is something I'd like to address from a community leadership standpoint, and as a nonprofit organization that serves the startup community, one thing that we look at and we've started tracking very closely is who returns to our events. So it's great if we can get folks in the room, but we measure belonging right now in who's returning to the website for resources, and who's returning to our events in Startup Week year over year, or if that is whether those numbers are recycling. If it's the same people, that's success to us. That means that we're doing a great job, and it's a room that people feel included and that they belong in. If we know that we are going out for new numbers every year and looking for new faces to represent new communities year after year, then we wouldn't be succeeding. And so that's one example of the way that Beta is approaching the way that we handle belonging and the way that we measure success.
Thanks so much for that. this is an evolving space. And one of the things that's evolving, it seems like faster than ever, is the language we use to talk about this. And I can think of two terms, BIPOC and Latinx, that I've seen revisited even in the last 2 years. I'd love to know if there's language that you're using really intentionally, if there's language that you wish others wouldn't use upon reflection, or that if there's language that you wish you heard more. And Shelisa, we'll just keep it with you for this one and go back to Nick in a second.
It's important to note that it's okay to be corrected. It's okay to learn. When it comes to this space, the most important thing you could possibly consider is there's no wrong way to open the conversation if you're teachable, if you're open to being corrected, if you're open to learning something new. It's much better that we have the conversation and much better that we open the issue or nothing changes, right? We can't resolve anything if we're worried about the words that we're using to refer to different populations. And to know it's okay to ask. That's another theme at Beta this year as we've developed this community together as a team. As we're developing further and building awareness of what resources are available to entrepreneurs, we consider how hard is the ask, and it's okay to ask. It's easy to ask. A little scary at first, but be okay to be corrected. Don't worry about being wrong, because that's how we learn. And then make the ask. If you're not sure how someone identifies, it's okay to ask them.
Is there a specific term that in the last couple of years maybe you've grown more fond of, maybe there's language that is just affirming that you already knew, but that you just feel becomes more relevant, or language you feel like we should move away from? Are there any words that kind of fit that description, or not really?
Girl boss can die.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just candidly, that's one that I'd be fine never hearing ever again. But as we identify, we needed a little comic relief at 4:15 in the afternoon.
Oh, man.
But as it pertains to identity, it's personal preference. I know that there's a lot of political correctness that's important, and that's why it is important to ask. Personally, I prefer Black to African American. That's a conversation we've had a lot between the different identities represented in my family, and so that's interesting. But I ask a lot of questions of our community, of the founders that we serve. Staying curious will help solve for the blanket political correctness that seems to change every few years. Yeah. You can stay up on the articles, but ultimately it is about the individual. So it's important to ask.
I love curiosity as an answer and vulnerability as an answer. Thank you so much. Nick, same question. You in the context of HubSpot and working at your other organizations, you're an English major. So what do you think about the language part of this?
You did mention I'm an English. I am an English major. I do think so I'll answer your question specifically on words and phrases, but I really want to just highlight how important what Shelisa said is there will always be an evolution, and even communities that are impacted by these words and phrases, conversations are still evolving every week and every month on how they would like to be called and whether there are differences, and so I just can't. I think that's the takeaway, really. And for words specifically, one thing HubSpot does is we partner with an organization called Disability.in, which is one of the premier organizations that advises companies on disability inclusion. And what we're learning from Disability.in is that there's actually a lot of conversation right now about the word disability. For a good handful of years now, we've had differently abled and folks of different abilities come into play. As someone who talks with Disability.in on a weekly basis, I'm hearing that, in fact, they are advising companies to really stay in touch on that conversation, because right now the trend or the conversation is heading back toward disability, and even disabled as an adjective, which is not something that we typically do at HubSpot, calling a person or an employee disabled. And this is just one of many examples. I would say the conversation around Latinx and Latine is very applicable as well, because it has to do with gender, right? And how a word, whether it ends in O or an A, can imply a majoritized gender. And I think what we're finding is more important than whether you call someone Latinx, Latine, Hispanic, Mexican to be specific, right, or Peruvian. What's more important is just asking, because the Hispanic community and our Hispanic employees are not a monolith. They have different preferences, and they also, either due to their generation or just their own experience, may care a lot or not as much on how you get that right. And also there's something called code switching, right? So we may refer to ourselves as one thing when we're in a workplace, and if we're among folks who are like us, depending on who that us is, we might use different terms. I call myself a CAD, a Korean adoptee, when I'm with other Korean adoptees, but that's not how I call myself at work. I suppose rad CAD, it's just not gonna work. And so just understand also that I heard something a couple of weeks ago, you don't have permission to agree. You can agree with disagree with my opinion, but you can't disagree with my experience. I think that's what it was. And
really well put. And
so your experience matters, and also others' experiences matters, and more than anything else, what folks choose to call themselves is of utmost importance. That's what matters more than any political correctness.
Please.
One more note on this. I also think it's important to consider what assumptions we're making when we refer to someone. So the reason I don't like the term girl boss is because it assumes a female can't be a boss, and we must reduce her to a juvenile in order for that to be palatable.
How do you feel about the phrase,
right with me.
badass boss lady?
Badass boss lady, that's a little better.
All right.
But really considering what assumptions we're making when we call people by their identities. That's why it is so important to stay curious, and that's why it's so important for us to stay aware of what is professional, and why do we think about professionalism that way, and what context do we need to challenge when we're learning about others' identities and how they might like to be called. And so I just wanted to make a note on that. I think it's really important to consider our assumptions.
I think one of the things that I meditate on when I think about, especially the questions about language, is that language in this space is so caught up in identity, and identity is not static, identity is fluid. And how we understand our identity changes. And I think that a great illustration in this space is the conversation around transgender and transgender identity, gender identity specifically, because not only has the language, and I have transgender members in my household, I'm incredibly passionate about this topic, the language that we have today to describe the experience of people who are gender fluid or transgender is radically different than it was 10 years ago, is an entire universe and center of gravity removed from where it was 30 years ago. And we're now at the point where there's some genuine confusion, and it's genuine on all sides. I have a coworker who, we're now listing genders, he, him, they, she, him, they on Zoom, and their genders changed. And there's a responsibility that's perhaps a little bit unfair then for them to maybe have to explain why their gender changed, which they shouldn't have to. But if we return to those principles of curiosity and of being willing to be corrected, say, hey, out of curiosity, how would you like me to refer to you? Because I can change that pretty easily, but I need to be vulnerable to ask, and I need to be able to do that in a way that is fundamentally curious. So just a small editorial note. That's the only one, by the way, I'm getting as the moderator of the panel.
And also, I think I liken pronouns to someone's name. It's really the same thing, right? Not so much anymore. I'm more of a recovering Catholic, but I attended Catholic Mass every week as a kid, and there was someone in our church who sat next to my mom every single week for 20 years who called my mom Jackie. My mom's name is Patsy. And how well do you think you can really know someone or feel close to someone if they get your name wrong? And so I think really pronouns are no different. And if you get someone's name wrong, which I do, and if you misgender someone, which I have done, and I work in diversity inclusion, again, it's okay to be corrected. It's really about understanding how to get it right and better the next time. And I think we're all on a learning journey on that.
One of the things that I've seen small organizations and large organizations struggle with is the idea of wanting diversity to come organically, DI&B to come organically. And I've always had a pretty significant problem with that approach, but that's just my, okay, second editorial note. All right, we'll cap it there. I was just wondering if you guys have any response to organically as an approach to DI&B.
We addressed this a little bit, I think, but let's get into
prep
it.
call,
About intentionality. So nothing, Peter Drucker, right? What gets measured gets managed. And if we're going to be intentional about the organizations that we're building, we really have to take a close look at the things that are important to us. So it goes back to values. I might be okay to stop there. But it's just something to meditate on. What are we measuring? So one example, in this continuum of Beta as a nonprofit organization, the previous executive director, big love to Casey Schultz, she's watching online.
Shout out.
Yeah, she's amazing. In that transition, it was really beautiful to see the changes that she made and the intentionality that she displayed in ensuring that the stages at Startup Week were diverse. The stages represented female founders and female professionals in tech and female community leaders and BIPOC leaders and non-binary and differently abled folks. And I might be getting some of these words wrong because I'm not a DEI expert, but we all do our best and we're all on this continuum. And so to see and to have conversations with community members this year about how much it's impacted them to see themselves represented on stages like this one, and in the community, and in leadership, and in people who are getting funded, and in the way that we operate, and really work together to make this a beacon of equitable inclusion here in Minnesota, in our startup community. To see the way that intentionality in saying you can't have 4 white men on a panel at Startup Week anymore, and that is a policy for this organization, and that's the expectation, and there are consequences if you don't deliver on that. It can feel performative. It feels uncomfortable, like learning anything new. It's like, well, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it because representation is important. And we're doing it because we know that it makes a difference in the way that our ecosystem is equitable. And so, again, yeah, I have great respect for the way that this continuum continues, really, with this leadership. And so later this week, we'll get into more of the initiatives that we have now in being equitable as an ecosystem. But taking the time to measure and to know that you're managing your efforts and being intentional about the way that you grow a community or an organization or a startup or whatever it is, it's critical. You can't, organically doesn't work.
In case anyone in the audience hasn't noticed, shout outs is a superpower of Shelisa's. That was not a name drop, that was a shout out. It was awesome. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, my recommendation would be to not wait until you're past a startup phase to think about the policies and practices and behaviors that you've identified will get you closer to equity, get you closer to an organization and a company that you're proud of from a diversity inclusion standpoint. Because if you get to that stage of even scale up, which HubSpot has been at as a company, and also many of our customers are at as well, you'll find that the startup phase would have actually been the greatest time, looking back, to really think about those questions. And then, if you're past that and understanding, if you're a really mature company, maybe a company that's been around for 40 to 50 years, each stage looking back would have been a great time. And so my point is, it's never too early. And maybe by organic, I think you're meaning, it kind of just happens on its own. And yeah, to me, that won't happen for a couple of reasons. Number one is that intent is not enough. Just like the intention to grab market share is not enough. You need a plan, you need a strategy. You probably need a lot of trial and error to get that right, and hopefully, take a bigger piece of the pie. And D&I is no different. I think a lot of times the biggest misunderstanding is that we just need passion. It's about feeling. It's about intent, and that's not how business works. And that's not how it works in D&I either. It's literally the same lens of, okay, if this is where we want to head, we're going to have to think about this really intentionally and pair that intention with action, planning, trial and error, and a lot of super smart people to help us get there.
I do think it's important to note that the outcome is the feeling, right?
Yes.
But the strategy, the strategy is critical. It's absolutely critical to have a strategy to achieve the feeling, because that's what builds community. It's the way that people feel in the presence of the organization that you're running. And all of these aspects of strategy is what get us to the feeling that is brand, and that's what HubSpot helps us deliver on. It's incredible.
And the feeling of solving that problem, especially when as complex as this, could not possibly compare to the feeling of even those incremental solutions that you find.
You got it.
So one of the questions that I love to ask in these conversations is, as you have conversations about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, are there questions or a single question maybe that comes to mind that you wish you would hear more often? And Nick, we'll start with you just because I've been starting with Shelisa a lot.
Well, sure. It's a great question. Let me think. I think, one of the things that, Shelisa, you mentioned the word performative earlier, just a minute ago. And I think to me, what is the difference between being authentic in our diversity, inclusion, and belonging work versus performative? You don't have to use the word performative to ask the question, but a type of question that involves, how do we really understand and know whether our diversity, inclusion, and belonging work is authentic, is a question that I wish our team at HubSpot would get asked more, and then also that I wish we'd ask ourselves sometimes even more as a team that does this every day. Because, look, there's such thing as a check-the-box approach to diversity and inclusion, and I think the reality of this work is that whether you intend to or not, you can actually do more harm. Practicing diversity inclusion work, we don't like to talk about this as much, it can absolutely do more harm, even especially when you don't intend to. And I think to arrive at a place where you're not doing harm requires us to understand our definitions of not just DI&B, but authentic and performative. And that's probably going to vary from company to company and community to community. But until we align on that together, we're probably not bringing everyone along in the journey. And that's the most important part. Is my goal would be to put myself out of a job. I'm sure Jack will set me up with some other way to pay the bills. If we didn't have a D&I team, that would be my ultimate goal, because that means it's embedded into the fabric of that organization.
I got you, boo.
Great.
The way
Sign that and write.
It's being recorded. The way that I'm coming to think about this as you were both talking about this is, you can do physical therapy wrong, but to do it the first time, it never feels natural. And to do it right, you have to pay attention that you're not doing more harm.
I feel very convicted right now because my PT has reminded me of this many times. Yes, keep going.
All right, just wanted to make sure the metaphor carried through. Wonderful.
Yeah,
Shelisa, I'd love to know if there are questions you feel like you would like to hear more often.
Who are we serving best is the biggest question. We ask ourselves that all the time. Founders ask themselves that all the time. We ask each other as business leaders, who are we serving best? And then a follow-up to that is, who might be left behind? And if we can continue to question our decisions, you have mission alignment and mission drift. You also have community alignment and community drift. And it's important to take risks, but it is absolutely critical to ask yourself every day, who might be left behind here, who absolutely belongs.
I feel like the best shows actually end on a climax, and then some of them have a kiss off a little bit, and like I feel like that was our Aerosmith crescendo right there. That was absolutely fantastic. We have about 12 minutes left. We definitely want to get to some audience questions. So as you're paying attention from remote, please put those in the chat. As you're in the crowd, please start thinking of a couple, because we're going to be sending folks around with a microphone. But I'd love to end on a little bit of an upbeat note. I'd love to know, and we'll start with Shelisa here, when you look at this space, a space that's changed so much, a conversation that's changed so much, even in just this community, and not to mention the impact this community's had on this conversation around the world, what gives you hope about the direction we're going?
It's the progress. The progress, just like you're saying, to see how representation has made an impact on what's possible. I think of Vice President Harris with her confirmation. Well, our identity isn't exactly the same. And, regardless of how we're politically aligned, seeing her take that office and knowing now there's been someone who shares my identity that has achieved that, that was a glass ceiling shattering everywhere. And so that's one big example, but there are small examples like that every day where showing up in spaces is really, I think that's the takeaway in any DEI conversation, really any conversation in general about building community. You've got to show up. You've got to make sure that the you in a group is represented in the spaces that are aligned with your values. And so seeing something like that, the way that changed the bar that I believed was possible, I didn't expect it to affect me the way that it did. But when I really reflected on it, wow, representation is incredibly powerful. And so continue to show up in spaces that matter to you, because you don't know how that affects people who share your identity.
Thanks so much. And I'm going to give Nick the last word. I just want to step in with a brief short story about showing up in spaces. In June of 2020, we were living in Cambridge, and there were pop-up protests, pop-up discussions, some of them very, very angry, very frustrated, I guess is a better word, all over Boston. And we showed up to a bunch of them, my wife and I, and the vast majority were organized by teenagers. The vast majority were organized by high schoolers, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And the amount that I learned about, just from them, hearing them speak about how we treat language in our culture and their own personal rebellions against their own textbooks was incredibly powerful. And it was a privilege to be able to show up to those. All right, Nick, last word. What gives you hope?
My mic on, yes. Maybe 2 months ago, I was working with HubSpot's recruiting team on some initiatives that intersected with diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And a pretty recently hired director on the recruiting team started scheduling recurring meetings with me to chat about those priorities. And about a month ago, so about halfway through that time, he shared an update on the new set of priorities that the recruiting team would be taking on for the back half of the year. And what gave me hope is that he didn't ask, what DI&B priority should we add here, which would have been a fine question, actually. That would have been acceptable. Instead, this recruiting director, who, by the way, is white, cisgender, heterosexual male, grew up in Northeast Massachusetts, or Northeastern United States, like a lot of folks, historically at HubSpot, he said, how can we weave DI&B into every one of these priorities? And for him to have that mindset, for him to be able to take an approach of truly, sometimes even better than our team, I would say, to look at DI&B not just as an add-on, but as something that's built in. Any clinic we put on in the world about how to do that, he was displaying that right there. And it's conversations like that at HubSpot that give me a lot of hope, that even if we don't get it exactly right, even if we're still building that proverbial plane, that folks are asking really thoughtful questions and especially when they don't have DI&B in their titles or they're not on our team. They're just doing their work. That gives me a lot of hope right now.
That's awesome. We have a little less than 7 minutes left. And Summer, do we have questions from online? Okay, fantastic. Let's give a little bit of priority to the room. Is there anyone in the room who wants to ask a question? We can get Nate out to you with a microphone. All right, if you change your mind, raise your hand. Otherwise, Summer, take it away.
For sure. So the first question is from Ian. Looks like it's for the panel as a whole. It starts with a quote and then with a follow-up question. Start quote. For a long time, corporations have been talking about diversity. And the interesting thing is, it's the only area where you can talk a lot about something. Oh, I lost my spot.
I hate that Zoom chat feature.
Talk a lot about something, not make any progress, and still have your job. Everything else we do in corporate America, if we don't get results, we get fired. This quote is from Melody Hobson. What are your thoughts?
Amen would be thought number one. Thought number two is, right, what gets measured gets prioritized, as we've talked about today. So treat DI&B like any other part of your business. You can't get away with that in any other department of what you do as a company or an organization. And again, this is where you can do more harm than good. If DI&B is this fuzzy thing that doesn't get measured, doesn't get quantified, where you don't have a strategic approach to what you do, you're gonna do more harm. And I think that's tough to talk about, but it's the reality that this person and individual is sharing today, and I support that perspective.
Thinking about what I have to add to this, because that was a very good response. Yeah, it was a great comment. A coach of mine always told me, you want to go fast, you have to go slow, right? So finding those little wins, quick wins, as a lot of our company cultures call it, quick wins where we know that we can achieve impact and we can see results, but building on that momentum, that's how we can understand how what is otherwise pretty qualitative can be more quantitative. And so taking the time to meditate on it and consider what those quick wins are in community, that's how startups grow. And so I think in a space as uncertain and really new to corporate America as DE&I, perhaps you approach it that way.
Once again, if you're in the room and you'd like the microphone, just raise your hand. But Summer, is there anything else from the online audience?
Yes, we have two more.
All right, let's fire away at least one.
All right, so the next one from Gina. Inclusion is a word of power. Why are we still using it?
Inclusion is a word of power.
Power.
That resonates. Thank you, Gina. That is an incredibly important perspective. This really aligns with what we were discussing about what assumptions are we making. Well, if you're being included, and I think this is perhaps what Gina is getting at, if you're being included, it means that you're outside. You're outside of what, and why is that the power structure? And so that's a lot of what we've been seeing in the past several years. Culturally, in the United States, is this deconstruction of what the table looks like, and why we need to be included. What might it appear as, and what might it feel like when we talk about the feeling being the outcome? What might a community feel like where inclusion is obsolete because it's built to reflect who's already here? So I think that's a really beautiful comment and a really important thing to consider.
You know, I think when we talk about inclusion, this reminds me of a conversation we've had internally at HubSpot around imposter syndrome, right? And whether even the phrase imposter syndrome implies that the onus is on the person feeling that really to change that environment, right? Or change that expectation. Similar vein, when I think about inclusion, I think the questions of for whom and in what context are really important. And so when you think about power dynamics, whether that's historically, whether that's in a conversation with a leader, who is a few ranks higher than you. You know, all of those things come together to inform the way that we think about inclusion. And what we like to say at HubSpot, whether it's popular or not, is that for the majority of folks who talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, they're not talking about it as something that's out here, right? They're talking about it from their own lived experience. And so even conversations around diversity and inclusion, as important as they are, can be taxing. They can be exhausting. They can be disproportionately placed on folks of color to help educate others. And so I think, you know, exactly right. You know, if we're unable to recognize inclusion as rooted ultimately in the history of white supremacy, as well as majoritized communities currently, whether that's on a team or a department or a whole company, I think we're off. And so getting there requires us to acknowledge in any conversation who's in the room and who's not, and what do we need to change in order to get there before we even start a conversation.
Thanks so much for that. Summer, I'm going to ask you to copy and paste that last question. We'll see if our panelists can email and answer back, because we want to make sure everyone's questions are answered. But this has been a conversation about scaling diversity, inclusion, and belonging, whether you're a startup or a unicorn, and what it means to scale that culture at the same time that you're trying to scale a business. I cannot thank you enough each, Nick and Shelisa, for giving us your perspective, your insight, and your expertise. And I would just ask for a quick round of applause from the room for our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much. My name is Jack, and I am the head of Midwestern Partnerships for HubSpot for Startups, and I cannot thank you enough for joining us in the room. I cannot thank you enough for joining us from wherever you're joining us from virtually, and I cannot thank you enough for allowing HubSpot to be a part of Twin Cities Startup Week. Have a great rest of your night, guys.